Chapter 2. Things like that don't happen anymore. Mary. Joseph could have had a pack of dogs chasing him, he was running so fast. His sandals flapped against his feet as he tore through the almond grove. If my mother had been there, she would have told him to fasten them a bit better. But I just smiled and waited for him to collapse in a heap. "Mary!" he shouted again as he sped closer. "Mary!" He broke off and bent over with his hands on his knees, panting. "It's Elizabeth!" Elizabeth? My smile slipped. If I'd been expecting to hear some news, it wasn't about my great-aunt. "What?" I cried. "Is she ill? Has there been an accident? Is it Zechariah? Elizabeth always says those roads are dangerous." Zechariah was Elizabeth's husband. He was a priest, so he had to go away sometimes to serve in the great temple of the Lord. Elizabeth wanted him to do his duty, of course. She was very proud of him. But I knew she worried when he was away. Now I was worried too. "Has something happened? Tell me." But Joseph shook his head at my rush of questions. "It's good news," he said. "I just wanted to be the first one to tell you. Your Aunt Elizabeth is..." He paused dramatically. I folded my arms. "Pregnant." He flung out his hands with an air of triumph. "What?" "That's ridiculous," I said. "Elizabeth is..." I didn't know how to put it without being rude. "Well, she's far too old." Joseph was nodding earnestly. "But you know I'm working in Sepphoris at the moment. I keep hearing these old women gossiping. I heard them yesterday as well." He hesitated. "I'll tell you about that another time." But today they were talking about Elizabeth. He was serious about this. I could see it in his eyes. He really believed that my elderly great-aunt was going to have a baby. "What did they say?" I asked cautiously. "They said, well, they weren't very polite. You know what people have said about her in the past. That she's cursed. Yes, and that she's a disgrace to her family." I could feel myself getting cross. Just because she's never had a baby. Poor Elizabeth. She'd watched everyone around her, all the friends she'd grown up with, have children when she couldn't. Then she'd watched those children grow up and have their own children. She was always cradling other people's babies, always chasing after other people's toddlers, always hearing the chanting of children at their lessons, yet she'd never had a baby of her own. And people whispered behind their hands that God must be punishing her for something. Hadn't she been through enough without that kind of talk? Joseph was looking at me apprehensively, waiting to see whether I'd start getting all indignant. I contained myself and fell silent instead. "But if she's pregnant now," he said gently. I grinned. "They'll have to take it all back." These old women I overheard didn't know what to think, Joseph told me. One of them was saying she must be making it up. Then another one insisted her niece had seen her with her own eyes, round belly and everything. "Do you really think it's true?" "If I didn't, I wouldn't have run all the way here to tell you." He plonked himself down on the ground with a sigh and started rubbing his feet. "Your great-aunt wouldn't fake it, would she?" "Of course not." "Then it must be true." He looked up at me again. "By the way, I have something to ask you." He looked serious. I sat down next to him, waiting. He coughed. You wouldn't happen to have any of those nice honey cakes your mother makes?" I laughed. His news might be strange, but some things would never change. Joseph would always be hungry. I decided to save the news until later, when the whole family was gathered around the fire for dinner. Everyone was quiet. My brothers were busy stuffing themselves with soup-soaked bread, and Ma was ladling portions into bowls for my little sister Abigail and me, while my father poured out the water. "Joseph came today," I said brightly, "and told me that Elizabeth and Zechariah are going to have a baby." My mother stared at me, soup dripping off her spoon. "What?" "He heard some women in Sepphoris talking about it. One of them has a niece who's seen her." "Mary," said my father patiently, "that cannot be true. Women cannot fall pregnant at Elizabeth's age." I was ready for this. "Well, Sarah did." They couldn't argue with the old stories of our people. She and Abraham were even older than Elizabeth and Zechariah when she became pregnant. And Hannah was the same. Samuel the prophet was born to her, even though no one thought she could ever have a child. Sarah and Hannah lived a long time ago, Ma told me. Things like that don't happen anymore. Why not? Why couldn't they? Well, her lips pressed together impatiently as she passed Abigail her bowl. Those babies were a special gift from God. And they were born centuries ago, Mary. Sarah and Abraham lived before our nation was even a nation. Things are different now. I don't see why. God could give special gifts again. He doesn't do things like that these days, chipped in Reuben, my oldest brother. He ran a hand through his hair. He doesn't care about us. Reuben, said Bar, angry. He cares very much about us. How do you know? Because he has promised. It was the kind of thing Zechariah would have said. Bar took another mouthful and I waited while he chewed, wondering if he'd say more. His eyes were closed. Maybe he was thinking about all the wonderful promises God had made, or all the stories of the things he'd done. Perhaps he was about to explain to us how we were part of God's chosen nation, how even though we had been ruled by a string of other peoples across hundreds of years, we were still God's prized possession, the children of Abraham, and one day things would come good again. That's what Zechariah would have done. When I was little and he visited more often, he would take me on his knee and tell me stories of all that God had done and all that he had promised to do. Zechariah knew everything there was to know about the scriptures, and he loved God with all his heart, all his soul, and all his strength. Even though he had no children of his own, even though he had to leave Elizabeth alone sometimes in order to do his job, and even though Jerusalem was filled with soldiers nowadays, and everyone said that once King Herod died, the Romans would take over entirely, Zechariah always believed that God had a plan. He has promised, he used to tell me, tapping his nose and smiling affectionately while I wriggled on his lap or pulled at his long beard. Then he would begin a story. But when Bar said, he has promised, he didn't have anything to add. He finished chewing and opened his eyes to see us all looking at him expectantly. He cleared his throat. What are you all looking at? Go on, eat your dinner. Then my mother sighed loudly. Oh, Abigail. My sister had food all down her front. I dropped a piece of bread after I dipped it in the soup, she giggled. More than one piece by the look of it, I said, and went to get a cloth. After that, everyone forgot the subject of Elizabeth and Zechariah, until the day the letter came.